Welcome. It's another episode of In the Crosshairs, brought to you by Line Sniper. Line Sniper, the definitive resource, of course, for not just sports betting content, but also in-game analysis. Really happy that you're with us. I'm Ken Barkley. You probably know me on Twitter as Lockie Lockerson, kind of a crazy parody name of all the touts out there. And we're going to get into some tout discussion probably a little bit later in the show, to be perfectly honest. But let me welcome in my co-host too for some really good college basketball discussion. I'm going to guess that if you're a viewer out there, you're a listener, this episode will probably be unlike a lot of sports betting content that you consume. And one of the reasons for that is that we have someone who, let's be honest, is an originator who can get a lot of money down, who can talk about sports betting in a way that I can't, and in a way that, let's be honest, a lot of people that are doing podcasts, that are doing shows, can't. So I think the show is probably going to be a little different, but in a way that's hopefully really helpful to everyone. And so let me introduce not his real name, just like Lockie is not mine, but Dr. Odds. And Doc, how are you today? How's everything going?
Hey, Lockie, what's up, man? Good to be here. Thanks for having us. We're going to get into some college basketball. It's a typical Wednesday slate today. Got a ton of games in the midweek Wednesday, Saturday motion going on. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me, and let's get some college basketball going.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think for people that maybe they bet all sports or they dabble in college basketball, Wednesday is Saturday is the ultimate. It's the pinnacle. There's, 180 games on a day or whatever. But, based on the conference schedule, conferences play on certain days. Wednesday's busy, man. Like Monday and Tuesday, you're trying to prep the rest of the week and stuff. Wednesday, it's a marathon. It's like just a flood of openers, a flood of movement throughout the day. The board, as we're doing the show, and I'm trying to update my spreadsheet, the board is just lighting up with stuff. I'm trying to make sure I have accurate numbers. So, real quick, just for people, because I think you're gonna say a lot of things that might shock or surprise people that are casual bettors. So, in order for them to kind of take you seriously, just kind of give us just a little bit of background on how you not even just approach college basketball, but like where you exist in the space, like what you're trying to bet on, how many games you bet, like just approach and all that kind of stuff.
Right. All right. So college basketball, for those of y'all who might not follow it as closely, or for people like Lockie said, who are into NBA more, who might be more familiar with the way professional things work. So as mentioned, Wednesdays and Saturdays, now that we're in January, that's when the conference season has really started. So enough of, Duke scoring 45 points over Incarnate Wood, enough of any Ivy League or Patriot games taking place on like a random Monday night in the middle of nowhere. So we're talking about teams that know each other really well, teams that with any continuity have taken lessons in from the day before, and the numbers are baked into there. So the way I view it, I really view college basketball as so there's two different seasons and two different completely related but separate seasons, as in the non-conference season in November and December, where you have those bad matchups, where you have blue bloods, taking pay games, so to speak, if you were to use the college football terms, and really taking that and making it very different. So now we have closer games, we have teams that know each other, and we have coaches that really are playing to each other. And if you think the numbers don't reflect that, then you're wrong. So in terms of how I do my modeling, I actually have two separate models and two different sets of numbers, and basically, different types of regressions and charts that I use to look at the two different seasons. Because if you're going to take, for example, the ACC, or especially any of the Power 5, Power 6, if you include the Big East, you're going to get spreads that are much lower, right? So we're going to be talking about Seton Hall, Xavier today. We're going to be talking about Georgetown, St. John's. Those games, those spreads are not going to be past 5 or 6 most of the time. Either way, if you get in some home court advantage in there, we're talking really small edges. And for me, I feel like this is really when the Power 5, Power 6 conferences get really, really hard on a daily basis if you were to try to bet every game or try to bet even every day that they play, just because the lines are so tight. It's not that the numbers will necessarily reflect the results, because as we know, just because a game is a pick'em, they might lose by 10, right? But there's no real way of sort of expecting that variance in the beginning. So it's from a numbers perspective, there's a lot more subjectivity that I use that I need to get into it. In non-conference season, I just look at my tables. I see that Duke's going to blow this team out by 28, and the line is 24, so I'll take it. But if they're playing Georgia Tech, if they're playing Miami, then I'm going to be a lot more closely tracking players. I'm going to be a lot more closely tracking playing style, what kind of defense they're running. Is it going to be 5-on-5? It's always going to be 5-on-5, but what kind of defense are they going to do? Is it going to be zone versus perimeter? How much threes are they going to shoot? Do they like long twos versus short twos? So a lot of that stuff that I think NBA originators and cappers talk about a little bit more, I think sort of are much more relevant in the conference season just because of the parity that's there. But even then, in the early conference season, I still see a lot of value in certain spots, which we'll get to. Just because before teams start get rolling in their real conference, again, they're used to different teams. Lower conferences are used to playing harder opponents and vice versa. So teams like the Patriot League and America East have been matched up against other teams that they have never really prepared for. And give or take what college coaches actually do during non-conference season. But conference season is where it matters, right? This is what matters for tournaments. This is what matters for seeding. This is what matters for who gets into the NIT and so on and so forth. This is where all the real money is. So I think the lines are tighter, but if you add a good number of subjective stuff on top of it, actually kind of know the teams a little better, especially in the non-popular teams, non-power conference teams, there's a lot of value to be around.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like a lot of really awesome stuff, I think, to unpack there for people that maybe they just make numbers and bet openers. I mean, that's more my style. Maybe they bet based off feel, or they watch a lot of games. That could be one other thing. But I think the coolest thing about all of that is it's the convergence of something that I think is really intuitive for people that don't bet, and something that is actually plus EV. And that's the idea that there's like a pivot point that occurs in the middle of the season between non-conference and conference play. So even if you're just a college basketball fan, like I can think of 10 coaches off the top of my head who use non-conference play. It's like you're just throwing stuff at the wall. It's a test case. You're all right. Let me experiment with some different lineups. Like, let me try like running different sets and see what works. Greg Campy at Oakland, who's like a famous, excellent, like low mid-major coach, is notorious for like punting on non-conference play. And then he'll get to conference play and pivot into like an insano like covering machine, especially in early January, because everybody thinks his team stinks. And it's like, no, he was just testing stuff out. So, it kind of goes to show no matter what sport you handicap, the more you can get into the weeds with the nuance and the sort of things that what makes college basketball different from college football, what makes college basketball different from the NBA. And you can identify those pivot points and be on top of them before the market necessarily adjusts. Like that's valuable. And I think the reason for casual people why that'll hit home is like, even if you just watch college basketball, that teams punt on non-conference or play differently or whatever. I mean, even like on the most treetop level, like John Calipari Kentucky teams at the start of the year, like the team's never going to look the same way that it looks in conference play that it's going to look in non-conference with too many new pieces, too many moving parts. So, I think just of all the things that you kind of said that were valuable there, it's sort of like whatever sport you pick to handicap, and we're going to talk about college basketball, what are the segments of the season that behave differently, and how can you implement, kind of changes to your approach to take advantage of that?
Right. The closest analog for basketball-related sports that I can think of is really NBA pre-All-Star game and post-All-Star break, right? So there's a lot of talk about how the drafting process of the NBA leads to a lot of tanking. There's a lot of there's a lot of mental psychology or arithmetic or gymnastics that people do with how teams want to go into the playoffs, how they want to hold their form, or if they're looking for a draft pick. And same thing with the NFL. There's a lot of sort of speculation that goes on there. That stuff I think is a little bit softer and not necessarily always accurate. I think when you get into like March and April at the very tail end, when you're like, okay, well, there's literally nothing to be gained from Phoenix Suns winning this game, that can be a little bit valuable. But as you said, non-conference is when, especially the great teams, this is when we try to see how Kansas does without Doak on the table. This is when you really want to get your adjusted plus minuses off. I want to know how my team performs on defense, on threes, on perimeter stuff, on paint stuff when my top player is out, right? I want to try out my bench guys. If it's going to be a blowout game, this is when I put, guys that would never even smell conference season. This is where I do it. When I travel to Hawaii for those tournaments, the tournament means a lot, but if I'm down and it's going to be a relegation or one of the sympathy games, then I'm going to try a bunch of stuff. And you see that, and that stuff is really hard to predict. And I'm not sure about how that data would feed into conference season. I think I sometimes ignore some of that noise there. So there's a lot to be unpacked in a lot of these teams. The other thing I'll add is conference season, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of parity. And so when you get outside of teams that actually have a really good player, like Duke, Kansas, Kentucky comes to mind, I don't really think you need to know players anymore. And that's something we'll get to later.
Right.
But and some of these college basketball teams, I mean, every player is basically replaceable. And if you look at non-conference and you don't see any huge difference between who is there and who is off the court, you just look at team statistics. Like I can't name a player on East Tennessee State, but I'll bet on them. And that I don't think is something you can do. You can really say for a lot of other sports, especially a lot of other places. But continuity between data between non-conference and conference is a real big problem for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I agree on the player aspect specifically, and I feel like we could talk about process forever, and it would be honestly, it's fascinating. It's extremely interesting, even for both of us who we know what our process is. It's just really interesting to hear how someone else approaches it. So I kind of want to move on to some games, but I think as a result of talking about these games, we're going to come up with more process questions. We're going to explore how do we come up with these numbers, like what's creating the advantages that we see, the edges that we see, and how do we want to play them. So the best place to start, I think, is a game that actually I think we kind of agree on, and does, to me at least, have a little bit of player discussion and analysis rooted in it, which is Georgetown. So Georgetown's playing St. John's. Georgetown's at home. They open -4 at Pinnacle. The number's holding at 4 across the board, at least right now, which is interesting to me, I would say, only because I make Georgetown 6.5 in the game. And so I bet the overnight, kind of expecting a move. But Georgetown, to me, is one of those teams where who is playing and who is not playing has actually been impactful in handicapping them and trying to get an accurate market rating for them. One of their best players was out for the year at the start of December. Their second best player has kind of gone back and forth between questionable, missing time, not missing time, Mac McClung. So like it's kind of a situation where on most teams, I don't care who's playing and who's not, unless it's like by far like the conference player of the year or the starting point guard who averages 25 a game or something. But with Georgetown, I feel like knowing who's playing and who's not, and the trying to get a market rating for them has been more difficult, and that might be why the market isn't moving on this game.
I totally agree there. I will be very honest. I don't recall that Mac McClung was out, probably because I wasn't paying much attention to Georgetown during there. But I can just
Maybe it doesn't matter though. That's the funny thing.
No, I would disagree there. I mean, I'm looking at player projections for Georgetown, and Mac McClung looks like he's the second highest. He has the second highest usage rate at 26.5% of all possessions. So clearly a guy like that, along with your seven, if they're in for Georgetown, that makes a huge difference. And especially this game versus St. John's, a team that, has had a narrative, is in New York City, where I am right now. There's a ton of these media narratives in the big market, big power conferences. I find really interesting because there's a lot of stuff that the media and the public, the general public, quote unquote, looks at that just doesn't really translate well, right? So, the media narrative for St. John's is that, there's a new coach in, so it's like a new regime, and they don't really have much of an identity yet, quote unquote, and they don't really know what they're doing. And so it's sort of like a growing pain type of thing. But you could also say the same for Georgetown, who with Patrick Ewing at the helm hasn't really, I think has missed expectations by all media narratives. And so I really like delving into numbers and seeing if they back up what the media is saying, because the thing that happens a lot is they look at unadjusted numbers, right? They're looking at raw points scored. They're looking at St. John's gave up X in the second half, and therefore we conclude that their defense is Y,
or just record,
right? Or just record. I mean, that one's a lost cause. I mean, if you're looking at if you're capping basketball games by saying I'm never going to bet a team that's 5-10 based on non-conference college basketball, I think that's a long way to go. So record is out the window. But even for things like St. John's has a bad defense, I think once you adjust for, quality of opponent, I don't actually see that here. I mean, I think their adjusted defense is very average. I think definitely maybe a little worse, maybe around the same as Georgetown. But yeah, on paper, I don't see any adjusted efficiency, true shooting, which I'm big on, three-point defense. On paper, I don't see a huge difference between these two teams, other than the fact, unless you want to talk about drilling down to the player level, which, to be honest, for these two teams, I don't know that well. So yeah, I would say I agree a little bit, right? So the line is -4, and we're on the same side. I think that's just this is one of those where it's up in the air. It's not enough for me to bet. I think my number was like 5.5 or 5.8. So I'm on the same side as you, Lockie. But for me, actually, this is a pass because not knowing the teams very well and just looking at just grazing all over numbers after adjusting for efficiency and everything, they look pretty similar on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and you mentioned reducing things to the player level, like my style is basically, I'm not looking for, 3-point shooting versus 3-point defense or true shooting percentage versus, overall field goal defense or whatever. Like I'm really, really just macro. Okay. Like how does the market view these teams? How have they viewed it recently? Okay. Then I put time into really, really adjusting each team's rating as effectively as possible based on market information. And Georgetown has been a absolute nightmare in the market this year because the injury news just, again, like if I have them, okay, so like, top to bottom, I have Michigan State as like a 20 and I have, Northwestern State as like a -24 in my ratings and pace neutral ratings. So like the hardest part has been if Georgetown's like a 7 and then McClung misses a game, he's questionable the next game. Like the market is going haywire, but it's fueled by stupidity. It's not fueled by understanding of like whether he's going to play. It's overreacting one way or the other. So like, I'm not sure I'm out of the woods on Georgetown yet for my rating. Like, I'm not sure I don't think I have, like, I'd feel much better about my rating for Illinois or Nebraska or whatever, one of the billion other teams that's playing tonight that hasn't had these same issues. So you're right. It kind of like it gives me a little pause, especially to see no market movement at all. And like I'm supposed to be 2.5 off here, and like no one's interested in Georgetown on the board except me. So like that's kind of like, wait a minute, if this is so obvious, I think one thing people don't realize is like if a bet is so obvious, someone would be betting it. So like if it's not moving and if the price isn't moving, even in college basketball, like if the number's not moving, then you're probably at least missing some angle
that's extremely useful information.
Or pushes the other way.
Yeah, I agree. That's extremely, especially in, again, big market college basketball. I mean, big is relative, right? So we're not talking NBA big. We're not talking any professional sports big. We're talking college level big, right? And not even college football big. I mean, it's morning now. It's 11:30. It's 11:30 Eastern time. So on Bookmaker, you can get 5 dimes down. That's not huge, but it's something, and it takes a decent amount of money to move these lines, or a decent amount of player profiling to know that you're sharp to move these lines. So I agree. If someone who's sharp isn't moving it, if McClung is out and it holds at -4, or maybe it goes to -3, that's telling you the market thinks he's worth a point over replacement, right? So it's not like, the one thing that I think is another that I think average players or average bettors get wrapped up in is how much is a player worth, right? It's always about, it's like the WAR, it's like the WAR in basketball, in baseball that they're talking about. How much is he worth over a replacement player? A guy like McClung, I mean, he's that great. He might be worth, I don't know, 2.5, maybe 2 points. So if he's out and the market moves a point, I would say that's adjusted for, right? And then so if your response is, oh, I think that's not enough, I think he's worth 5 points, you're probably the one that's off, right? So
right. Yeah, absolutely. In the NBA, we see this all the time with, I mean, how many blog posts have I read that's like, what is LeBron James worth to the spread? And it's like, well, first of all, it's like that's not a pace neutral kind of thing. Like if the total's 240, he's going to be worth a lot more than if the total's, 198 or whatever.
Exactly.
And there's fewer possessions. But like, like he's, he probably is a 6.5 point player. And like, people will think that's asinine, but like, how I know that? Because the market adjusts 6.5 points immediately when he's out. That's how I know that. So
these are easily answerable questions. These are easily answerable questions with the right number.
It is not a question that requires scientific grant money to get to the bottom of.
Right.
So,
and it's not,
it's like we definitely know the answer. So, yeah, I mean, so I think Georgetown St. John's kind of provides an interesting discussion about when you have an edge, but maybe your numbers are a little shaky. What do you do? There's another Big East game that I think you and I are both interested in, actually, Seton Hall. So, like, we talked about this game just a little bit, Seton Hall Xavier, where I was really close to a trigger point to make a bet as of this morning. And I think we've actually now gotten there where Seton Hall is now +3 in the market, which to me is now, that's my threshold for betting. So I would bet Seton Hall +3 because I make the number +1. But kind of curious, here's another Big East game, tight spread, as you kind of predicted, conference play, low numbers. When you look at, Seton Hall and this game, maybe even compared to Georgetown, is this a case where you would trust your numbers a little bit more, or how do you view this one?
So this is something where I think I've actually followed the teams a little bit. I've actually sort of paid attention to Xavier more than Seton Hall. And from here, I'll tell you right now, my conclusion, and, other viewers can correct me later if I'm wrong, is that the media narrative is still over they're really high and they're really high and hyped on this Xavier offense, which I think with schools like Duke and Kentucky and Kansas, it's easy to fall into a trap of thinking, hey, they're a blue blood team. They're, they have history. They have good coaching. They have a tree there that's aimed for success. I think in the NBA, this happens with the Spurs, Lakers, and Celtics as well. I think it's really easy to fall into that hole. But then when you actually look at, again, adjusted numbers, and if you look at Xavier's conference schedule, so look, if you want to start debunking things, so Seton Hall and Xavier are very similar records. I think 10-4 versus 11-3. But if you look at the adjusted strength of schedule, much more tough schedule than Xavier has. And Xavier hasn't really blown anyone out. I mean, I feel with a weaker schedule like that, you're supposed to have a lot of scores. You're supposed to have a lot of efficient field goals, and we're just not seeing that. Adjusted overall for Xavier's offense, I have them around 99 out of 353 teams, whereas for Seton Hall, I have them around 50. Now, that may not seem like too big of a difference because you might be saying, who really cares outside the top 20 offenses? Are they really that potent? But 50 points in terms of 50 ranks in terms of a big power conference play, I don't think, I think that actually matters a lot, right? So that's telling me that this hyped, that all this media narrative from SB Nation and The Athletic and such is telling me that Xavier doesn't have the potent offense it used to have. And now if we look at the defensive side, Seton Hall, this defense has been vaunted all across everywhere that I've seen from anyone who has a clue. So I have them in the top 15. I have them as number 14 in adjusted defense, especially their turnover rate and their rebounding is off the charts, especially in the Big East. And I'm looking at Xavier, who has something just very average. I mean, average in terms of in the Big East. I think they're smack dab right in the middle in their own conference. They're about defensive efficiency of 40. So all told, this is a game where I think the offensive side, Xavier has a pretty big disadvantage, and then on the defensive side, Seton Hall has a pretty big advantage there. So this is something where a +3, and Seton Hall is at home. Is that right? Oh, no, sorry. Seton Hall is away. This is something that even though the game is taking at Xavier, I feel like +3 in a conference game is just a little too much. And I would actually expect Seton Hall to really control the ball. They're going to slow down the pace and just really use that defense on Xavier. And I don't know if with those offensive numbers, if they can go. I forget their true shooting numbers at this point, but I'm a big fan of that because it tells me in the pressure of high defense, are you able to get efficient shots off? And from what I recall, Xavier hasn't been able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a fan of true shooting as well. When I do my NBA handicapping, that's a part of what I try to implement. Absolutely. So for people who sort of aren't familiar with metrics or whatever, if you had to hone in on stuff, obviously 4 factors, which everyone kind of knows, but true shooting specifically is really, a little different than effective field goal percentage and also valuable. So would encourage people to kind of use that tool as well when they're doing their handicapping. One thing with Seton Hall that I find really interesting, and with one point with Xavier too, is Seton Hall, again, another rating that's been, you have to pay attention. Like Miles Powell plays, he doesn't play. Like you can get off on a wacky course of action in terms of adjusting your Seton Hall rating if you're not paying attention, right? And even though, I mean, he plays against Michigan State, but you watch the game, he's on one leg. That was actually one of the few games I've watched them play this year. And, it's just, you got to be really careful with like, okay, like I'll move their rating up here or I'll move their rating down here, but like my baseline for them probably needs to not change. And I need to know what that is. I need to know what kind of their average is, because otherwise I can look at the market the next game and be like, oh, I'm 4 points off. Like I'm a genius. And it's like, no. It's because like I overreacted to that Powell game where he was missing. Right. So like Seton Hall, I think that's been my problem with them. Similar to Georgetown is like, who's Miles Powell? Well, he's only like the most impactful player possible that can play on a basketball team this season. So, right. Like he matters. And then Xavier, to play off your point about overrated, underrated, or what the market thinks about them, et cetera, like to me, they're the perfect team that gets overvalued because all of their strength in terms of coming into the season and projecting is based on returning production. So like if you have a bucket of average players and you bring back the entire bucket, how much better can your team be? That's like Xavier is attempting to answer that question, basically, where it's like they didn't recruit anybody different. They weren't particularly awesome last year. Their coach is going into his second year, but like there's nothing new about Xavier. It's just like, well, everyone's older, so they're just gonna be so good because all 5 starters are back. And it's like I have them. I kind of keep them really kind of tempered in terms of like I don't have any futures on them, and I know people who do, and I think that's crazy. But like it's just, again, it's like when everyone comes back and everyone's not that good, how much better can the team be? So like I think kind of a couple notes in that game too, where these teams kind of have some interesting paths this season.
And I think it shows in the numbers. I mean, I think Xavier's playing at a slower pace this year. Their average possession length, I think, is only like 17 seconds, which is, a notch, maybe a second and a half below what they were last year. So, same exact returning crew, more experienced angle, quote unquote, and yet you're playing slower. Your offensive production isn't there. You're defending pretty well, but you're going up against a team with Miles Powell and a lot of good paint production as well. I don't. That's something that's all in the mix there. So I like Seton Hall. I think I make them. I just checked my numbers. I think I make them -1. So that's a pretty strong play. That's a 4-point difference now in the market. So I'm rolling with Seton Hall +3 all day.
Nice, absolutely. So somehow we've come to the end of two Big East games, and we're actually kind of on the same side of both, which is a little miraculous to me. So, all right, really good discussion, both Big East games. I think hopefully viewers got a lot out of that from an informational standpoint. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk about Duke a little bit because let's be honest, like everybody likes talking about Duke. They might be the best team in the country, and I want to get Doc's play of the day on a school you probably have not heard of, and it's in a location you probably cannot name. So that's a pretty good tease. Anyway, we'll be right back in the Crosshairs, brought to you by Line Snapper. We'll be back in a little bit.